Number 5, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement in relation to part privatisation of state-owned assets that, quote, there'll be some wholesale investors from overseas who will want to buy a little bit of these shares, end quote?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes. New Zealanders will be at the front of the queue and have substantial capacity to invest. But we expect there will be some interest from wholesale investors overseas. That will help ensure that we get good value for taxpayers' money. But the amount left for overseas investors is likely to be small.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Question, Mr Speaker. Why did the National Party attendees at the recent conference totally disbelieve their Minister of Finance when he made that same claim?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, they didn't.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The newspaper was wrong, was it?
Order.
Mr Speaker, what restriction, if any, will there be on those buying shares in state assets from on-selling those shares to foreign investors?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I pointed out on the occasion the member is referring to, the government doesn't intend to bring in ongoing selling restrictions because if we're going to have a market, we may as well have a market. But I would point out to the member that in the last 4 or 5 years there's been a trend towards greater New Zealand ownership of the New Zealand Stock Exchange and less foreign ownership. In the case of the Port of Tauranga, which is under mixed ownership, New Zealand ownership proportion of Port of Tauranga is growing, and we believe that with the success of the government's policies in encouraging New Zealanders to save, New Zealanders will want to buy these shares and they will hold on to them.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, when there is no restriction at all on people on-selling the whole 49% of those shares to foreign investors, how can he make the claim that 85 to 90% of those shares will long-term be in Kiwi hands, or is that just wishful thinking?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, we believe that New Zealanders will retain the shares. I mean, that's the track record of the last substantial float directly to New Zealanders. And as I pointed out, with New Zealanders now saving more, there is a trend towards New Zealanders buying back the foreign ownership of shares.
Amy Adams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, what recent evidence has he seen of strong local demand for domestic assets?
The Honourable Bill English.
Oh, well, Mr Speaker, there was an example just last week. Air New Zealand, who was set up as a mixed ownership company by the previous Labor government, and have operated in that way, well, I presume the Labor government knew what it was doing. I presume they knew they were setting it up as mixed ownership. But they raised $150 million of 5-year bonds from the local market. There was obviously very strong demand, and actually there was no need to sell through a public pool because there was such strong demand for Air New Zealand bonds, and we believe there'll be the same kind of strong demand for Air New Zealand shares.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, is he prepared to give an absolute guarantee that a future national government wouldn't sell 100% of the shares in any state-owned asset? And would that guarantee be as reliable as his promise, quote unquote, we will not be increasing GST, and the other one, that the KiwiSaver, the government share going into the KiwiSaver, would remain intact?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the government is doing exactly what it said it would do. Before the last election, the National Opposition said that it would retain all state assets and it would not sell any until or unless it had a mandate from the New Zealand public to do so. In this election campaign, we are campaigning on the mixed ownership model, and New Zealanders will have the opportunity to vote on a very clear proposition. And as part of that, we've guaranteed that the government will retain 51% ownership.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, does he stand by his earlier statement that dividends from the state-owned assets that will be sold or part sold helped pay for social services such as healthcare? And does it follow that if he is selling half of the shares in those companies, then half of the dividends, which would have been the previous financial year $800 million or the last financial year $900 million, will no longer be available for that purpose.
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, certainly of the $800 million that the member refers to in the last year, about half of it won't be available again because it consists of the proceeds of the asset swap done between Meridian and Genesis Energy, effectively releasing $500 million to the government. Of course, spending is going to be tight over the next 3 or 4 years because we're still trying to get hold of the rapid upsurge in spending that occurred under the last government.
Question number 6, Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.